Okay. Good morning and welcome all to this meeting of the Audit Committee. I have to say and welcome to Alison, who's joining us for the first time, at least in she gone out of it?
I think I've lost the convener.
Sorry about that. It just dropped me out of the meeting. First of all, first item, are there any apologies?
An apology from Councillor Coleman, convener.
Thank you. And next, are there any declarations of interest? None. Turning to item 3, the minute of the Audit Committee held on the 21st of June 2021. You'll all have copies of that. Are there any questions regarding the minute or any corrections? Happy to accept that as a true record.
Happy to agree, Nina.
Thank you for that. So moving now to item 4. These are the unaudited accounts of the Falkirk Council for the year 2020-21. And we'll also be considering the Falkirk Temperance Trust accounts. Brian, you're going to introduce this report for us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, convener, and good morning. This report represents a significant landmark in the annual financial calendar with the presentation of the accounts. I would just like at the front end to acknowledge the work of Danny and the rest of the corporate finance team in both meeting the statutory deadline of 30th of June, but also their ongoing work to try and improve the presentation of the accounts and make them more reader friendly. So in terms of the short cover report, convener, you can see in the background section that the council has delegated authority to the Audit Committee to deal with the consideration of the unaudited annual accounts. We'll see later in the paper that when the audit's completed, to further consider them before recommending relaying on to full council. In terms of section 4, the considerations, maybe just drawing in particular your attention to paragraph 4.2 and the references therein to the management commentary and the annual governance statement, which are clear key elements, I think, for the reader of the accounts to give important context. There are a range of public notification arrangements that we need to comply with, and they're set out in para 4.3. And just picking up in terms of the closing of the cycle, so to speak, once the auditors have completed their audit, they will come back to this committee for your consideration before being referred on to council. There is still flexibility in the time frame for the audit to be conducted, primarily, but perhaps not exclusively, driven by COVID. So we'll see how the audit goes and pick up on a suitable meeting for us to present the audited accounts for your consideration. And I think that just takes us back to the recommendation at section 2 at the front end of the paper. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, you mentioned that there are further efforts being made to make the accounts more readable, and there's no doubt that the management commentary in particular is very good reading and very clear and well illustrated. I've no question at this moment, but any member wish to ask a question regarding these accounts? Alison, yeah.
Thanks, Convener. They certainly make an interesting reading. There's a lot of depth to the paper. I look forward to it coming back when they have been audited for a further look. But I was just to ask, page 37, and I did ask for clarification from our head HR, which she did give me, but I'm not 100% sure about some of it. So Karen actually gave me reassurance about the SGC employees. I'd asked why they had increased so much in the £50,000 to £55,000, pay grade, and it was obviously because of differences in terms and pay and conditions. That for me, like I was interested because obviously last year we were in the middle of the pandemic, and I was thinking, well, we can't have taken on more staff, but I never really got a full explanation of why the number of employees went up from 129 to 159 in that category. And I'm just wondering if it's the same, if actually what the explanation that Karen gave me actually applies to that section as well. So it was just for clarification. And it's page 37.
Stuart, yeah, I see you.
Thank you, Convener. I think what we find is that the bands in which salaries are represented don't change from year to year. But what does change from year to year is the amount that employees earn, and that can change for two reasons. One is the annual pay award, and the second one is where employees get an increment, and a combination of increments for people who are at the top of the scale plus pay awards can take people who were at the top of the previous band, just flip them into that new band of £50,000 to £55,000. I think the explanation that Karen tried to provide to Councillor Black was along the lines that it's just an increase in salaries for staff as a result of pay awards and of increments that has just moved employees from one band to another.
Thank you, Stuart. That answer your query, or blank?
That all the sections in that paper and that graph are related to changes in pay terms and pay and an increase because of regrading, etc.
Councillor Nimmo, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. Just a couple of quick points. The first one, I raised this at a pre-meet earlier on, but it's just for public consumption, really. In relation to the recommendation on page 11, I'm not actually quite sure what we're being asked to do here in relation to the recommendation, and I fully appreciate it's all about accountability and it's probably to do with standing orders. That's why it's included on the agenda here. But we're being asked to consider this report as the part of the recommendation, but everything seems to have been done that needs to be done. There's nothing for us to really do here or to try and authorise, but this committee doesn't have any powers to agree anything as such, it would have to go elsewhere. So I'm a bit confused regarding the recommendation and what's been asked. That's my first point. My second point relates to the pensions table at the top of page 41. Now, I know that all elected members, as far as pension contributions are concerned, they are published on an annual basis, but this only details the pensions for senior councillors. And I'm just wondering why it doesn't include all councillors' pension contributions. That's my 2 points, convener.
Good. Brian, are you able to answer those points?
I'll endeavour to do so, Chair. Whether I'm successful or not, you can judge. So on the first point, I think the points made by Councillor Nimmo are correct insofar as the specific things that need to happen, such as the submission of the accounts by the due date, the inspection period, and what happens hereafter, are in effect givens, and the report has given you assurance that these have been complied with. But the consider in the first line, I think, invites the committee, having received the full set of accounts, to make any comments or ask any questions, as was illustrated by Councillor Black's comments. So that it does provide you at the outset and prior to the audit the opportunity to raise any issues that occur to you from the document in front of you. So I think that's, I would suggest, the explanation for how the recommendation is framed the way it is. In terms of your question on the pensions, the answer may be that not all members are party to the pension scheme, and what's listed there may be just those that are. But if you're aware of a particular member who is a contributor to the pension scheme and isn't included, clearly the answer extends beyond that, and I would need to go back and check that out for you.
Convener, just on that point, if I can maybe pick up on what Brian's just said, I've been a member of the pension scheme since I think 2009, Brian, and obviously my name's not included on the list. It does seem to be just senior councillors that are included in this table here on page 41.
Well, perhaps then, in the same way that senior officials are included, the regulations stipulate that the same applies to councillors. But I see Grace from EY may have had her hand up there that can come to the rescue here and maybe give a more complete answer to that point.
Thanks, Brian.
Sorry, I was just trying again. It is because the remuneration report is only covering senior councillors, so there's a definition that we check about who is included as a senior councillor. So we'll look at that list to decide whether the people who are in that list have met that definition, and that's why it's only them that are disclosed within the remuneration report. But councillor pay and expenses and things like that are disclosed separately on the website, but they just don't feature in this report here.
Okay, thanks for the explanation.
Thank you, Grace. Any member have any other questions at this stage?
Yes,
I've-
Convener, I had a couple of questions I wanted to ask.
Certainly. Sorry, I
Okay,
didn't see your hand, Cecil.
That's okay. What I'll do is I'll give all three questions, and that'll give officers a bit of thinking time in between. First one is relation to something that's historical that we've continually had, is it's an overspend within our children's services, particularly within children's services social work. And we have our Closer to Home programme that is one of the programmes to improve the services, but also to help reduce that overspend. And I was just wondering if we are confident that the Closer to Home programme will indeed actually help meet that gap going forward. I appreciate this may have been already raised in other forum, but this is an opportunity to just have that out discussed in public, convener. That's the first one. The other one is related, and that is our current financial position is probably looking very positive, but we still have a significant gap over the next 5 years, and it's how our change programme will feed into that, and how significant will that be, and what will be the extent of the gap going forward. And the final one, I think, will be for Mr. Duff, is in relation to our rented properties and whether there's been a drop in the rental income as a result of the pandemic. Do we have high numbers of vacancies or underpayments that may impact on the income to the council going forward? And are we looking at any of that to increase the income coming in and help those that are difficulties? Okay, thanks, convener.
Thank you, Cecil. Taking this. Oh, it's Kenneth, is it? Kenny. On the first question on the children's services, we Kenny, can you
Hello.
pick up that?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So the question was, will Closer to Home meet the gap in terms of the projected savings for Closer to Home, yeah? Okay. I wasn't coming to this meeting to answer that particular question, Leader. However, the Closer to Home project is working towards reducing the overall spend in terms of the children who are looked after by Falkirk. The actual projections I can't give you right now, but I can ask Leslie James to work with me to give you a written response following the meeting. I do know that social work are working very hard at the moment to achieve savings that were originally in the Closer to Home, but also to recognise the increased demands following COVID on the vulnerable children in our society. So I can ask Leslie for an update and I can provide that to you after this meeting.
Okay, thank you, Kenny. And the second question regarding the funding gap. That one for Brian.
Thanks, convener. I'll pick it up. It may well be that colleagues may wish to come in behind me. And I think we do, as reflected in the business plan, face, as most, indeed all councils do, very challenging budget gaps to be bridged. And the Council of the Future initiative is a fundamental platform to help us address those gaps. And ideally, we're looking for win-win situations, which of course in the real world isn't always possible, but where we can improve services for the people that we serve and make savings at the same time. That's the sweet spot, the Goldilocks spot we would like to get to. And in practical terms, to supplement what Kenny's just said in answering the Closer to Home question, that precisely is a project with those credentials, that pedigree that both has the capacity to deliver significant savings and make a real difference to the lives of a very vulnerable client group that we're very sensitive to and for. So the Council of the Future programme of itself will not be able to, given the scale of the gaps, fulfill or close the budget gap in itself. But there are other strands to it. The zero-based budgeting programme, for example, needs to do a fair amount of the heavy lifting there as well. And I think also, to be candid, convener, members will face in the current budget round some very difficult, as they always do, decisions on balancing what is a very challenging 22-23 gap, currently estimated at 18 million, but subject to key variables, notably the outcome of the pay award, and ultimately the revenue support grant settlement could materially widen that gap and make the challenge bigger. So we need to be realistic about that. Hopefully that helps in addressing the question. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Brian. Sorry?
Convener, it's Douglas. I'll come in on the question about the rental income, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you.
So the property estate is actually fairly well let, and we have seen increased lettings arise from the impact of COVID, particularly on our industrial premises, a lot of interest in warehousing, etc. space. So actually the portfolio is over 95% let, and so that has been quite healthy in recent months. But in terms of the backlog and rental payments, that's not showing as a budget pressure. There is a report of the executive tomorrow noting the various budget pressures that we have for this year, and it's not noted as a pressure currently, as we have an arrangement in place with our tenants for repayment. So we have staved off any pressures arising for them through agreements with the tenants that we've sought to enter into, so that we can stage their repayments of any gaps within their rental income. And so we're not seeing this as a significant risk at the present time.
Hey, Douglas. Are there any further questions? I have one, I think probably for Grace, actually. Brian did touch on this, and we'll remember that in the normal scheme of things, the timetable for the presentation of the audited accounts in years gone by has been at a meeting in September, although because of COVID pressures last year, this was put back to November. I'm just wondering, is the lockdown, is this causing continued pressure on our external auditors and their ability to undertake the audit functions? And do we have an idea of the projected timetable for receipt of the audited accounts this year?
Yeah, happy to take that. So in our plan, we actually set out that we were aiming towards the end of October for the finalisation of the accounts. And so there's quite a few reasons behind that, but all have been generated by COVID, in particular on our team, and I guess auditors across the piece, which is why Audit Scotland actually changed their initial guidance, which had said deadline end of October, and they extended that out into November, recognising the pressure on auditors everywhere. So audits do take longer in a remote environment. We're finding that so every single audit that we've undertaken has just taken longer than usual. So there's obviously pressure on our team, and obviously that longer period to carry out the audit impacts Falkirk Council as well. So there's part of that going on, and I suppose just some tricky issues just throughout the audit that impact all councils, just make it a little bit longer to complete the audit. So at the moment we're still on track to meet that end of October deadline without having to go into the November period that Audit Scotland is now allowed for. But obviously we're just, I guess, keeping that flexibility just to make sure that we don't have to move things around again like we did last year.
Okay, thank you, Grace, for that. If there are no further questions, are we happy therefore to accept the recommendation on page 10? Happy to accept.
Happy to agree, convener.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, we now move on to the accounts of the Falkirk Temperance Trust. And I guess, Brian, you want to introduce us to those?
I don't think there's very much to say, convener. These are tagged on to the council's accounts. There are a couple of nominated trustees, councillors, and it was a quiet year in the trust. There was no transactions undertaken, so nothing really to comment there. It's straightforward.
Thank you. Are there any questions regarding the trust accounts? So I imagine that it is a matter for the committee noting these accounts. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, which is the Council of the Future Risk Register update. And that should be from the Director of Corporate and Housing Services.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, convener. This is the latest in a series of reports on the Council of Future Change Programme Risk Register. Reports on the programme risk register are reported to this committee on a 6-monthly basis. Whilst this report deals with the risk register, separate reports on delivery of the change programme itself are reported to the executive, to the scrutiny committee, and to council through our business plan updates. Paragraph 3.3 of the report sets out the various ways and places in which members are kept up to date on the priority projects and the programme in general. As I just mentioned, included in tomorrow's executive is a report on the latest update on the programme, and that will be the first of the new financial year. Members are kept up to date through representation of each of the political parties on the Council of the Future Board, and through monthly briefings for all elected members on our priority projects. And just last week we had the monthly update briefing for members, and we're a Council of the Future Board meeting too. Coming to members in September will be the first of the reports dedicated to individual Council of the Future priority reports, and that will just be the first in a sequence of reports coming to members for decisions. Turning back to the programme risk register in front of members this morning, the hierarchy of our registers are set out in the table in paragraph 4.1 of the report before you. The Council of the Future Board considered the risk register at its last meeting last week, and looked at the risk register on a 6-weekly basis, i.e. each time the board meets. I'd emphasise that the risk register looks at the risks for the programme as a whole, not all of the risks for the individual projects. They are set out in each project risk register. Section 4.5 of the report provides information on changes to the risk register for the programme since it was last reported to Audit Committee. 2 risks have moved from green to amber since we last reported, and they relate to partners and to people, and both reflect the ongoing work in terms of restructuring of council services consistent with the Chief Executive's report to council earlier this year, and both relate to the integration of the trust into council structures. There is one risk which is red rated on the risk register, and it's red rated after mitigation, and that's the risk relating to political decisions not to support the council programme. And I mentioned earlier that the Council of the Future Board met last week, and one of its items of business was to consider the current risk register. And having considered the register, the view of the board was that that red rating should remain in place for political decision making. The programme risk register itself is set out in Appendix 1 of the report, and the recommendations convener are set out in Section 2, and I'm happy to answer questions that members have. Thank you.
Stuart, are there any questions? This report. Right, Cecil, yes, Councillor Meikle's on, yeah.
Thank you. I was just thinking a wee bit more about just particularly around the comment, that final comment around the highest risk and the mitigation. And I just wondered if there's any further mitigation that could be done that would help support or reduce that risk in some way. Just I'm looking for a wee bit of explanation in relation to the final paragraph about how the decisions can help influence the political and leadership of the council, and just how that can be done. Stuart, couldn't remember who it was that spoke there, sorry. But I'm maybe asking a very technical question that's not easily answered. I appreciate that, just because of the political nature of it, but it'd just be interesting to know if there's anything that could be done to bring that risk down.
Thanks for that question. I think there's a bit of an acid test coming up for elected members over the course of the next few months or so. So I mentioned earlier on that members will start to receive reports on each of the priority projects within the change programme. And it may well be that if members accept the recommendations and support each of the change projects that we bring forward, that we can look to reduce that risk as we go forward. So I guess that the kind of proof's going to be in the pudding on this, and as we bring each of the priority projects forward, let's see what happens with the political decision making of members. And as I've mentioned, we review the risk register on a 6-weekly basis at each of the board meetings, and on a 6-monthly basis to this committee. So when the committee meets again in 6 months' time, a number of reports will have been submitted to members for consideration on these top 10 priority projects. So I guess we'll be better informed in 6 months' time as to what that risk is. I think what we can do is, as we bring each of these reports forward to members for decision making, is make sure that we continue to do as much briefing of elected members as possible, whether that's through the monthly briefings that we have, whether it's through individual group political group meetings that we have, but just maximise the information that elected members have before we ask them to take important decisions.
Thank you, Stuart. There's Alison, Councillor Black.
Thanks. It was I can't actually see the page number, but anyway, it was under the risk partners and stakeholders. I mean, we've seen for ourselves the last couple of weeks that is a big risk with health and social care, and there's such a shortage of staff from our external providers and from ourselves. And I just think that it's a huge risk. As obviously after the pandemic, carers are really tired. I mean, unpaid carers and staff are really tired. So I don't know, I just like, obviously it's highlighted here as a high risk, but it definitely is that. And I don't know what more we can do, because I know there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, but I don't know what more we can do to try and help with that. But it's we need people. If we're going to deliver services, we need people. And if we've got a shortage of people, that's a real struggle.
Stuart, you want to?
Yeah,
Oh, no, Kenneth. Sorry, Kenneth had this.
Yeah, just in relation to the health and social care partnership, I suppose two things. One is specifically in relation to the transformation of these services. I think there's a very clear and well set out business plan that the Health and Social Care Partnership has in terms of taking forward the transformation of its services, which I think is really important. I think the challenge, as Councillor Black quite rightly points out, is the immediate impact of the pandemic, the impact on staff, which is ongoing and significant, and actually showing very few signs of reducing at the current time. Impacts not just on the ability of the service to deliver the really critical day-to-day services, but also over time impacts on its ability to deliver that strategic program of change. So this is something that we're, is right at the forefront of our considerations. I'm, in very regular contact with Patricia to talk about how we can support and help the work that's ongoing. But I think that Councillor Black is right to, raise that as a really critical issue at the current time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth. Stuart, anything you want to add to that? No, it's fine.
no.
So, any other questions? I have just a brief question. It's regarding, I think, the last risk register under people, where you talk about a specialist council of the future business partner being in place. Could you just explain a bit who this is and how they were recruited?
Yeah, thanks. I'll pick that up, convener. So we've got 2 or 3 specialist business partners, one in HR, who we have recruited on a temporary basis with change management experience in HR matters. So they are working alongside Douglas's team, for example, in the roads and grounds maintenance project, and they'll work alongside other change programs as well. We've done the same for finance, so it's about bringing in some temporary resources, typically for a 12-month period, that one brings skills that we don't have, that commercial expertise, but secondly, just a kind of boost to the resources that we currently have at the centre. So kind of 3 business partners, 1 in HR, 1 in finance, and we're looking to try and recruit a commercial manager as well. And I think the title of that post kind of speaks for itself in terms of what we want that person to do.
Thanks, Stuart. Are there no further questions? In that case, we are happy to note the Council of the Future Risk Register. Okay. And we move now to the final item, which is the Audit Scotland fraud and irregularity. And ask Isabel to introduce this paper, please.
Yeah, thanks, convener. So this final paper today provides an overview of a report that was published by Audit Scotland in July of this year. It highlights what Falkirk Council's internal audit, risk and corporate fraud team have done and continue to do to provide assurance in the areas mentioned. At section 4, you will see that Audit Scotland sets out 7 recommendations that public bodies should have in place to ensure good governance and counter fraud arrangements. The table makes clear the recent and ongoing action undertaken, as well as highlighting those areas where further action will be taken over the course of the next few months. You'll also note at paragraph 4.2 that I've listed the 7 Audit Scotland fraud-related risks mentioned in the report.
I'd therefore like to draw your attention to Appendix 1. This table provides you with information in relation to the work that's been undertaken by internal audit in 2021 and the planned work for 21-22 in each of these fraud-related risk areas. To finish, I draw your attention back to the recommendations at paragraph 2.1, particularly noting that services will be asked to review their governance arrangements for the prevention and detection of fraud. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Isabel. Do we have any questions? No hands. Councillor Black, thanks.
Yeah, it was just to say that one of the most important things for me, and I've been talking about people with colleagues and friends who manage like smaller organisations, is the small things. You know, like we spend a lot of time looking at the big things and the big tenders, the procurement. It's the bigger things, but it's the small things, and it's the reasons for things maybe staying the same way for a long time. I just think that sometimes we need to look at the smaller things, and so that, you know, it's important that like junior managers are really aware, you know, why something's done and why it's been done for so long, etc. Just I think that that's something that we need to look at. Maybe we haven't done that so much in the past.
I think there's elements of what you say that we try within the section to try and raise the profile of. So we get quite a lot of information in from different sections who maybe there's been a concern over invoices that have come in, so there's been a change of a bank account, and generally over the council we get copied into a lot of different correspondence about that, because I think culturally we're quite good of thinking we need to let internal audit know that, so we can keep an eye on where things going and add an avenue to give some of that information out more widely. If there's, for example, a supplier who has come in and said they've changed a bank account and they want the money's all now to go for this new bank account, which turns out to be a personal bank account or whatever. So I think we are quite good. I think we can always be better on that.
That's reassuring, thanks.
Thanks, Isabel. Anybody else got a question? Cecil. Yeah, Councillor Meikle-Dunn, thank you, Cecil.
Thanks, convener. It was just a wee bit about how are we going to know how effective the services have taken this on board and know that they have reviewed their governance. Is there going to be any way of being able to monitor, do a kind of backward look and just check? And how will we know we've made a difference? I suppose with this it's probably quite difficult because you don't want to have fraud, but if there are things in our systems that could potentially be open to fraud, then what are the mitigations that are being put in place? I don't know if I'm explaining that terribly well, Isabel, but hopefully you've got the kind of gist of it.
I think having brought it to yourselves today, my next step that I'm intended to do is to work with the corporate risk coordinator and to try and develop almost like an assurance statement for fraud. So provide a report to services, highlighting the parts that are relevant to them, and then look for feedback via the assurance statement on what they've already put in place for fraud and irregularity and what they intend to do about things where there's maybe weaknesses. I think, yeah, you're right, it is a very difficult area because a lot of times you're not going to know until there's a fraud has occurred where your weaknesses are. You'll see from the table in the appendix where we try to cover off a lot of those areas, and it's, I think for yourselves, it's reassuring that in the 7 fraud related risk areas we're covering off all of them by some way or other in the last year or in this current year. Now, we're never going to be able to do everything. You know, no one's expecting that. But I think when we look at our programme, we are trying to assess risk and look to where we think the most risk is. So I think there is a bit of comfort there that we seem to be doing what Audit Scotland have highlighted as being the key concerns. And yes, it's one of those things where we just need to keep an eye on it.
Happy with that, Councillor Meikleton? Yeah. Any other member questions? Maybe just touching it again on a similar thing to that which Cecil raised, but I'm just wondering what processes are in place to learn lessons from fraud investigations which have been closed.
Yeah. Well, again, that's quite a difficult thing, because it depends on what the nature of the allegation was, whether it had to be investigated. And in investigating it, we do a report. So if there are recommendations that fall out of that require a report, it will be reported into that operational area, so that head of service or to HR, to directors, whoever it needs to go to. So if there are recommendations being made, one of the recent lessons learned that you'll have read in the report stated that we were going to start doing a management action plan. So that will make all of the recommendation information will be in one place, and there'll be a bit more accountability as to who's going to take forward that recommendation and when it will be implemented. So the way I'm thinking that will work going forward is that corporate fraud team and or internal audit, depending on the nature of what that closed investigation was, will look at what has been put in place to make sure that these weaknesses or issues, whatever it may be, have actually been addressed and any gaps closed.
Okay, thanks, Isabel. Are there any further questions? There have been none. Are we happy then to note the report and note also that services will be asked to review their governance arrangements for the prevention of and detection of fraud?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. That concludes the meeting, and I thank you all for your attendance and for your questioning. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks, Convener.
Yeah.